Barcelona. Antoni Gaudi's final civic work, built between 1906 and 1912. Casa Mila, named for its patron, Per Mila i Camps. Sometime around 1910, Señor and Señorita Mila paid a visit to the site of their new house. The story goes that they were torn between fury and despair. The Casa Mila, which was supposed to be to the greater power and glory of the Milas, was immediately given a derogatory nickname by the townspeople of Barcelona, La Pedrera, the quarry. People were rather puzzled by this structure, built on the corner of one of the wealthiest avenues in the city. Gaudi would not be held to time nor to budget, but obstinately pursued eccentric artistic options. He angrily imposed his will. He passed his time in wielding civil and divine threats, evoking both lawsuits and the Last Judgment. He refused all discussion. Yet he had a very high reputation in Barcelona. The enlightened upper middle class appreciated his parks and palaces, and the clergy his monasteries and religious buildings. Nevertheless, the house he built for them was hardly finished before the Milas found that it was quite simply horrid. What happened? Is there really an architectural intelligence behind this plastic delirium that some considered to be pure eccentricity? In 1860, the Cerda Plan, named after its author, was a town planning scheme to redesign and enlarge the city of Barcelona. Main thoroughfares were created, new avenues crisscrossing at right angles like Spanish garrisons. On one side of these wide, straight avenues, going right through the city from the center to its outer limits, Gaudi, breaking all the rules in force, set a wall on a soft slant instead of an angle. With this facade, he pushed the destructuration of an architecture based on line and right angle to its very limit. Gaudi, with his passion for anatomy, thought of his building as a body covered with a skin. The columns were to be the building's skeleton, the stone its flesh. The columns, dressed in stone, rise up 6 stories to the attics. These columns bear the weight of the building. This facade is not a load-bearing wall, but just a curtain wall inserted between the metallic elements that project from the main girders. There was nothing more to do than to fill up the spaces between the columns. Gaudi could add or subtract the blocks of stone as he liked, creating huge windows, 150 in all, and immense balconies. The facade could be adjusted at will. It could be sculpted, twisted, made to ripple in a continuous movement that gives the impression that the whole mass rides along in its own undulating rhythm. The facade of the Casa Mila became a piece of sculpture. The balustrades of the balconies are made from scrap iron. Not the usual material for a luxury building. This was in 1910, and we can feel a premonition of abstract art in these shapes, as well as a blend of archaism and modernism. Gaudi maintained that he sought his inspiration in the observation of nature. Gaudi did not neglect the rear facade, even though it would only be seen by the neighbors. Serpentine balustrades, the facade rendered in a mixture of chalk and cement, color. But behind the work of art, there was the schedule of requirements of the promoters. The Milas engaged Gaudi to design a building for them that, apart from their own residence, had to include some 20 flats to rent, parking space, attics, a terrace. How was this impressive mass to be converted into a living space, open to the light of day? He envisaged a building constructed around two large interior patios. The first patio is circular, intended for living in, a center of interaction and a source of light. It was an innovation at the beginning of the 20th century, breaking with tradition. Gaudi considered the courtyard of a building to be something other than a more or less insalubrious hole. Here there are no leftover facades, blind, forgotten, or concealed, but just a large internal space. The second patio is oval in shape. By making these real interior facades, architecture is no longer exalted only on the side facing the city. It makes its presence felt in the very heart of the site and in the daily life of its inhabitants. Between these two patios are the air shafts. Gaudi put the drains and ventilation systems for the kitchens and bathrooms here, thus ridding himself of the functional constraints that would otherwise have spoiled the look of the two large and prestigious patios. They are connected by a passage that leads to the basements, with the entrance to the parking area. They say that the architect had at first thought of making a spiral ramp from the basement right up to the top floor. Carriages would be able to carry their passengers to each landing, and the horses would go back down to their stables in the basement. While Gaudi gave up this idea, he had to resign himself to designing a parking space for the motor cars that were becoming more numerous every day, especially among the wealthy folk living in La Pedrera. The area has since been converted into a conference room, but at the time, this underground car park was one of the first to be built in Europe. An umbrella-like structure hangs over the garage. It is not welded, but held together with nuts and bolts. The floor of the circular courtyard is held up by this metallic structure with its central crown and girders. Gaudi took his inspiration for this device by studying the system for supporting the roof of the crypt in the Cathedral of Barcelona. Gaudi spent an infinite amount of his time in complex calculations of loads, stresses, and geometry. He surrounded himself with helpers. There was Bayot the builder, and also the architects Berenguer, Rubio y Belver, the sculptors Laurenc and Matamala, and especially Jujol, who assisted Gaudi in finding his way from an architecture that was notably marked by historical references, like Viollet-le-Duc, toward a formal and highly singular freedom. Building work took 6 years. Austere, celibate, Gaudi's eyes were turned toward heaven, and that comforted the bigots. But he was audacious and fascinated the middle class, who, with their newly gained wealth from the colonies, were often just a touch show-off. Senor Mila was very prepared to make sacrifices for the sake of his architect. The architecture of the Casa Mila is a complete work, down to the slightest detail. Gaudi wanted a building to be open, without sudden boundaries between the inside and outside. The main entrance is a wrought iron opening with a gate. They do not close off the building. Large paned windows were not known at the time, so he invented a collection of irregular shapes that made up a sheet of small protected windows. The Casa Mila is not only an apartment building, it is also a townhouse. A monumental staircase, for the exclusive use of the Milas, worthy of a chateau or a palace, goes no further than the first floor. Gaudi was as much a decorator as he was an architect. In the oval patio, the Milas, as ever, had the right to a second private entrance. Another staircase, suspended over the void, once again marks the glorious and strategic place given to the promoter's dwelling. It is built to look as if it floats in the air without losing the idea that this architectural feature has to be a real piece of bravura. Leading up to the piano nobile, which contains the Mila's apartment that occupies the whole of the first floor and overlooks both patios. Now, the apartment has been converted into an exhibition space, which was made possible because the columns, as with the facade, structure the building. As the walls were not load-bearing, removing them had no effect on stability. Senora Mila disliked the furniture designed by Gaudi for the interior: chairs, armchairs, screens, buffets. She changed the interior decoration of her apartment into a neoclassical style that corresponded better to her idea of real luxury. But she prudently waited until the death of the architect in 1926 to conceal the undulating ceilings and cover up the irregular columns, damaged by the mysterious inscriptions engraved on the stone, which have only recently been revealed. Pardon. Forget. Is the Casa Mila a townhouse or an apartment building? Contrary to the archaism of the owner's staircases, Gaudi incorporated an innovation that was for the use of the tenants alone, a lift as the central and exclusive axis. He made the middle class of his time give up their traditional master staircase. There is no other exit from the landings except for the lift. No other way up, no emergency exits. The problem for Gaudi was to organize the space into both single and multiple residences to accommodate the power aspirations of the patrons and the imperatives of the tenants. Gaudi designed a double building in which the architectural elements interrelated without any of them being exactly the same. Acting on this premise, the architect distributed the apartments so that each of them has an interior facade giving onto the patio, and also an outer facade on the street. While the Milas had an apartment taking up the whole of the first floor of the building, an area of 1,600 square meters, the rented apartments were crowded into several upper floors, 400 square meter apartments on each floor, 2 to each landing around each of the patios. The dwellings are arranged around a main corridor along the interior courtyard. That is all they have in common. The absence of load-bearing walls, just as in the Mila apartment, gave Gaudi complete freedom in the way he laid out the interior space. The partitions can be altered, rooms can be added or made smaller. Each floor is different. The organization of the apartments is variable. It is only right at the back of these luxury apartments that the little service stairs and emergency exits are to be found. Although they only have an auxiliary role, here, as everywhere else, you are borne along the waves. Each of the banisters undulates at its own rhythm, the wrought iron forms constantly renewed. Even though these little stairways are accorded no more than a discreet entrance from the bottom of the patios in order to emphasize the preeminence of the lifts. Situated above the apartment floors, only the attics have a terrace. Gaudi's idea was that the attics and the terrace of the building should constitute a protective area and a roof, respectively. It is no longer the columns that structure this part of the building, but the catenary arches in brick that avoid adding the weight of a heavy terrace to the building. The big brick columns are not load-bearing. This is the stairwell. It leads up to the terrace. There it becomes badalo, a construction imagined by Gaudi, parts covered with fragments of stone, marble, enameled ceramics, others coated with limewash and plaster. 270 parabolic arches form a brick vaulting. These arches have no bearing pressure points, and the compressive stress on the bricks gives the arch a unique strength. Although the attics are no more than insulated areas used for washing and drying linen, Gaudi showed a marked taste for religious architecture. There is a dominating sense of unity, but the variations in level are implied by the terrace, saved by the sets of steps that follow up and down the rhythm of the arches, because it is certainly the attics that hold up the terrace. At the beginning of the 20th century, terraces were still considered as areas for waste, for henhouses or dovecotes, and clotheslines. Gaudi wanted to homogenize it all, looking for solutions between the rhythm of the facade and the finish of the roof. He soon came into conflict with the municipal regulations because his terrace took up too much room. All sorts of utilitarian functions were designed to go into this unusual roof. The upper part of the stairwells, ventilation shafts, chimneys, water tanks. Never any conventional air outlets. Some chimneys stand alone. Others are grouped in clusters to avoid a dispersion of smoke outlets. This unstable space, changing and chaotic, was a source of danger for anyone using it, but Gaudi the mystic refused to put safety rails around the vertiginous patios. The guardrails were accepted in exchange for the excessive size of the terrace. Gaudi could have his dream terrace, but with guardrails as well. Between the temptation to be flamboyant and a taste for improving or even improvising, the Casa Mila seems to teeter between the trivial and the sublime. Everyone decides on his own interpretations. There are no equal moments here, nor favored points of view. As a finishing touch to his edifice, Gaudi wanted to hoist a statue of the Virgin Mary to the summit of the monument he dedicated to Mary full of grace. Senora Mila and her husband were certainly a very pious couple, but all the same, they had ordered a building that was intended to be let out, not a cathedral. The disagreements with Senor and Senora Mila went to such lengths that the satirical papers reported them. Degenerate balconies from which, the ultimate crime in Catalonia, it is impossible to hang out the washing. A cage for rats and crocodiles. Sheds for zeppelins. As years went by, the scandalous Casa Mila gave rise to more indifference than passion, and it was no doubt Salvador Dali who was one of the first to reinvest the premises, to claim responsibility for the tormented source of a Catalan soul. Gaudi was 58 in 1910, when, furious against the promoters, for the last time he surveyed the still incomplete labyrinth of the Casa Mila and left before it was finished. The Milas refused to pay the whole of his fee. Gaudi took them to court and won, and the Milas had to mortgage the house to pay him. Retribution achieved, Gaudi donated all the money to a monastery.